Did you know the Lusitania sank in less than 20 minutes after being struck in 1915? In the middle of a war, the ship was still crossing the Atlantic as a symbol of speed and luxury. What is most unsettling is how quickly stability collapsed after the first impact. Today, you are going to see a reconstruction of those 18 minutes with details faithful to the ship and the period. Before the exact moment of impact, like the video and subscribe to follow the full sequence. May 1915. The Lusitania pushes through the North Atlantic in fog, holding high speed despite the heavy sea. On deck, passengers try to keep their routine, but the cold wind and short visibility make it clear this is not an ordinary crossing. On the bridge, the watch is constant. Any shape on the horizon could be a threat. The crew checks lifeboat lines, canvas covers, and metal fittings, more out of precaution than any real expectation of use. The war feels far away, but it dictates every detail of care on board. Little by little, small changes in the sea begin to draw attention. As the fog shifts, the ship appears and disappears inside thick banks of vapor. Officers watch changes in the water and visibility, trying to read the environment with almost no clear reference points. Passengers move between outdoor and indoor areas to escape the cold, while service continues at a normal pace. Even without an alarm, procedures move to the front of the line. Pulleys, pins, lines, and internal routes are kept clear. Everything seems to be working, but with more attention than on a peacetime voyage. The war enters daily life as a constant suspicion. The tension builds without a single warning that explains why. The bridge keeps the horizon under watch, and the crew reinforces simple tasks that can turn urgent in minutes. Corridors and stairways stay crowded with movement, with passengers looking for shelter from the wind, and crew members moving quickly while keeping routes open. Outside, the ship remains steady and fast, leaving a long wake and constant foam along the hull. Normal life still exists, but it feels held together by habit, not real safety. Small details start to matter more. A shift in the wave pattern, a lower band of fog, a strange sense of emptiness on the horizon, and below the surface, the threat may already be tracking the route without being seen. In wartime waters, danger does not always show on the surface, and it almost never warns you first. A submarine can shadow the crossing from a distance and wait for a brief moment of visual confirmation, when the target silhouette becomes clear between fog and sea. From the deck above, no one can see what is below, and routine continues as if the Atlantic were only weather and discomfort. Even so, the crew keeps the boat deck organized, checks lines and fittings, and avoids obstructions as a preventive measure. Inside, doors and passageways remain clear for movement, because any blockage becomes a delay in a critical situation. The crossing continues, but the margin for reaction gets smaller without most people noticing, and the attack depends on exactly that. A target moving forward, unaware it is already being measured. The approach is silent and calculated, with short movements to reduce detection. The bridge tries to read the sea by patches and patterns, but the fog hides almost everything. Passengers stay on deck, shielding themselves from the spray, while technical areas below keep a steady vibration. The submarine only needs a clean alignment and the right distance. Once the firing solution is ready, reaction time on the surface is almost zero. The Lusitania keeps moving ahead, unaware the attack has already begun. As the attack nears the decisive moment, the gap between routine and emergency is measured in seconds. Underwater, the torpedo runs straight, driven by calculation and opportunity. On deck, some crew members look more at the ship's side than at the horizon, as if waiting for a physical sign. The bridge keeps watch, but there is no clear warning for an immediate maneuver. The ship is still driving forward hard, and that creates a false sense of control. Then physics changes, first as a shock, then as cascading failures. The impact does not begin as an image, but as movement. A violent jolt runs through the structure and changes the balance of the deck. In fractions of a second, steps fail, objects slide, and hands reach for railings, because the ship changes behavior without warning. Almost at the same time, below the waterline, the strike becomes bubbles, turbulence, and a breach in the hull, creating the flow that begins feeding the flooding. The ship is still above water and for a few moments seems to hold together, even maintaining part of its forward motion, which can confuse anyone looking for a clear sign of how serious it is. But the damage has already compromised compartments and internal pressure, and that speeds up the loss of stability. From this point on, the priority stops being the voyage and becomes stability and evacuation, with time measured in minutes. The second internal explosion worsens what the first shock started and accelerates the loss of control. Steam and water flood areas that should remain dry, affecting engines, power, doors, and circulation routes. Corridors begin to tilt, and the vibration changes from a steady engine pulse to an irregular mix of pops, groans, and metallic impacts. Outside, the crew rushes to uncover boats and expose lines, trying to gain time before the list makes launching impossible. Passengers react in a chain, dropping luggage, moving toward the higher side, and using railings as their only stable reference. From here on, every small delay becomes the difference between lowering a boat and just watching the angle get worse. The operational collapse is not one event. It is a fast sequence of failures piling on top of each other. The Lusitania loses predictability. The list increases and turns the deck into a ramp. Passengers look for routes upward and toward the higher side, abandoning luggage to keep their hands free. The crew tries to set lines and start short lowers, but the angle is already interfering with the davits. Outside, the water strikes the hull in a different way, closer and more violent. It becomes clear the time window is small, and not every boat will be usable. Each minute passes faster than the ship's organization can keep up. From here on, every minute is worth more than any perfect procedure. The ship leans farther, and the foam beside the hull shows the water has already beaten the internal compartments. Boats may begin to lower, but they need total control to avoid smashing and becoming useless. People move toward the highest areas, and the sound of the ship changes. More structural groaning, less engine. If you want to follow how these 18 minutes unfold step by step, like the video and subscribe, because what comes next is the sequence that defines the entire sinking. The Lusitania is now in a real countdown. The list is already obvious, and it changes the ship's behavior minute by minute. On the boat deck, lines and pulleys begin working out of alignment, and the lowering stops being predictable. Passengers try to keep children close and move toward the higher side, using the rail as a guide and reference. On the lower levels, water and steam press against doors and passageways, reducing options and creating choke points. The noise of the hull, the waves and metal under strain takes over the environment and makes coordination harder. From this point on, even simple tasks require strength, balance, and timing. As the list increases, a lifeboat can become a hazard instead of a solution. The crew tries to control the swing and keep the boat from hitting the hull, because one hard strike can wreck the structure. Higher up, people move sideways as if they are on a wet ramp, searching for height and room to breathe. Below, water rises and visibility drops because of steam, with lights shaking and objects beginning to float. Under the waterline, current and suction show that flooding has gained scale and speed. Evacuation continues, but with repeated failures and very little time to fix them. A stronger vibration runs through the ship and worsens the loss of stability, as if something inside has finally given way. The structure answers with long, heavy noises, and the lines on deck stretch to the limit, demanding constant control. The crowd compresses toward the high side, and movement becomes difficult, with quick falls and immediate recoveries to avoid being pushed down. A boat that hits the hull is damaged in seconds, and every attempt after that becomes riskier than the one before. The speed of the sinking starts to become undeniable. There are no hours left to organize. What remains is improvisation inside an environment that gets worse every minute. The evacuation fragments. Some boats jam. Others become unusable because of the angle and the roll. Inside, water rushes through doors and corridors and creates routes with no return, separating sections of the ship quickly. On the surface, foam and a dark slick show that compartments are opening to the sea and releasing debris. The ship drops lower, with the funnels getting closer to the horizon and the bow dominating the descent. Time stops being measured in hours and becomes minutes, with decisions made by instinct and physics. The priority becomes getting off the hull before suction and turbulence grow stronger. Cork life jackets appear everywhere. and the deck becomes a gathering point on the high side. Lines are cut to free what is jammed, but that also creates whipping ropes and new hazards near the davits. Boats already in the water try to pull away, rowing in short strokes to avoid being dragged by turbulence and to keep distance from the hull. The bow is visibly lower now, and the sea reaches areas that were dry moments ago. Sweeping foam and small objects across the deck. The ship enters an accelerated descent, and the usable deck space shrinks with every wave. Anyone who hesitates loses the chance to choose the best path. The hull is no longer a platform. It is an inclined surface the sea now sweeps over again and again. Lifeboat gear loses usefulness, and people have to choose fast routes upward, avoiding areas where the water reaches first. Underwater, the current pulls canvas and wood down, reducing visibility and creating a powerful flow around the hull. On the surface, the debris field grows and removes safe space to maneuver, even for the boats already launched. The ship's silhouette drops into a critical position, with the sea winning by volume and weight, not by another impact. The dominant sound becomes water, structural groaning, and sharp metal cracks. With lifeboats already pulling away, the priority becomes distance from the suction point and gathering those in the water. The cold sea and heavy motion make long movements impossible. Everything becomes short motions, energy conservation, and a search for larger pieces of wood. The bow keeps sinking, and the sound of straining metal competes with the deep roar of the waves. Anyone on planks and panels tries to keep their face out of the water. Shifting between breathing and looking for a boat that can get close. Survival now depends as much on the environment as on rescue, which is still not visible to everyone. With each minute, arms grow heavier and coordination fades. The end is fast. What remains of the ship disappears and leaves only foam, oil, and currents at the sinking point. For a few minutes, the water keeps turning and pulling debris down like a whirlpool that is not yet let go. Survivors are scattered, separated by waves pushing everything in different directions and breaking up the group. The scene becomes a wide field of wood and canvas with no clear reference except the foggy horizon. The main danger is now cold and exhaustion, not the hull. Anyone who finds a boat or a large floating panel has a much better chance of holding on. After the ship vanishes, the fight becomes waiting and gathering around boats and larger wreckage, because being alone means losing heat and losing reference. People in small craft try to move closer carefully, avoiding a capsize in the cross seas and avoiding debris striking the hull. In the distance, a period steamship appears as a shadow in the fog, still small, but approaching steadily. Meanwhile, currents continue pulling parts of the ship down, dragging canvas and wood and changing the pattern of the water. The immediate focus is to stay warm, keep people above the waves, and avoid wasting movement. Every approach has to work the first time because the sea does not offer a second chance. The fog does not lift, but the sound of engines and the silhouette on the horizon show that help is coming. A period steamship keeps its distance from the debris field and launches a smaller boat to enter safely where the larger hull cannot. Between planks and canvas, survivors try to reach any more stable float and keep their hands out of the water to preserve strength. Lines are thrown, and every pull has to be short and steady, because the sea does not let anyone stay still. When someone is brought into the boat, the weight shifts and everyone has to reposition immediately to avoid capsizing. In freezing water, the priority is simple. Grab, pull, cover, repeat, with no wasted motion. The rescue becomes a sequence of repeated motions, carried out against the swell and the survivors' fading strength. The smaller boat pulls them in one by one, because any imbalance can cause new falls and overturn the craft. On the larger ship, rope ladders and lower access points receive the first survivors carefully, always timed to the rise and fall of the waves. Lifeboats with survivors try to come alongside without being crushed against the steamer's side and without fouling on floating debris. Wool blankets appear immediately, and metal cups pass from hand to shaking hand to keep people awake and upright. The goal is to get them out of the water before the body stops responding, and that takes repetition, not heroics. On the steamer's deck, care is immediate and practical. Thick blanket, firm seat, something hot, simple head count. There is no modern equipment. Everything depends on hands, rope, and maritime routine, with the deck wet and slippery. Those who come aboard are placed near the center, shielded from the wind, while someone adjusts blankets and straps to reduce heat loss. More boats appear in the fog carrying exhausted people, and the flow of arrivals starts settling into cycles. When the rescue ship turns toward shore, the distance from the sinking site finally grows, and that lowers the risk of collision with debris. The sea remains heavy, but the chance of survival improves because time is finally working in their favor. The coast appears first as a shadow, then as a shape, still inside the fog, with the sea changing color closer to land. The ship approaches the harbor slowly, while space is improvised on deck for disembarkation and for protecting the weakest from the wind. A low gangplank becomes the passage, and people step down in short strides on wet wood, gripping rails and helping arms so they do not slip. Those who can walk help those who cannot, using shoulders and forearms without needing words. On the dock, triage is simple. Sit, cover, warm, and separate the weakest for care first. The rescue shifts from sea to land, but exhaustion still sets the pace of every movement. On shore, the rhythm changes. Cover, seat, warm, record, always with simple materials and no modern look. Soaked belongings are gathered into piles, and cork life jackets appear everywhere as physical proof of what happened at sea. Volunteers and dock workers clear space, bring blankets and mugs, and arrange benches to keep people out of the wind. In indoor areas, tables and papers organize names and destinations without showing readable text to the camera and without turning this into a modern office scene. Outside, small groups form and break apart, trying to understand a sinking that happened so fast and the scale of the losses. The harbor becomes an extension of the shipwreck, now lit by lanterns, wet timber, and heavy silence. The next hours feel long, even though everything began and ended in just 18 minutes. Blankets and cups pass from hand to hand, and the sound of the sea in the background never disappears, even inside shelter. Some survivors remain still. Others walk slowly, still feeling their bodies react to the cold, the salt water, and the effort of staying afloat. Officials move in and out with documents and lists, trying to turn chaos into record. With no visible text and no modern atmosphere. Outside, the fog remains, as if repeating the scene from the beginning, but now carrying a different weight. The event becomes immediate memory, shared in the same place and on the same night, while the harbor tries to function again. The harbor grows quieter, but it does not return to normal. Because the impact extends beyond the physical rescue, the steamer remains anchored and movement becomes a silent routine. Distribute, record, shelter, reorganize the space for the next group arriving. At sea, the sinking site is far away and invisible, as if the ocean closed its surface and left no mark behind.
This video is an AI historical reconstruction, based on records from the time, created for educational and narrative purposes.
The consequences continue beyond the dock, because the sinking of civilians during wartime changes perceptions and decisions, and deepens the debate about safety at sea and responsibility on wartime routes. The final feeling is continuity, wind, water, and silence, with no visible sign of the ship. The Lusitania disappears from the horizon, but remains a historical and political reference for a long time.